Some of the scariest films ever crafted involve complex serial killer cases. It's a facet of horror cinema that has delighted, thrilled, shocked, and horrified audiences within the genre for years. You see, these types of horror movies do more than just the stock jump scare formula that so much of the output within the genre seems reliant on in this day and age. Rather, these films involve subjects and cases so immensely disturbing and horrifying to an almost unreal degree. They stuff suffocating dread and tension inside of an isolated and wholly unique experience, making for moments that immerse audiences thoroughly into the atmosphere and never let up until the credits roll. They are the types of horror movies that stick with you long after the credits roll, keeping you on edge and lingering in your mind for days afterwards because of how real and prevalent they feel outside of the borders of the silver screen. You see, these movies are genuinely terrifying because they aren't implausible. Whereas most of the competition within the horror genre out there is reliant on cheesy and borderline satirical horror imagery and jump scares to tell paranormal yarns, these films almost contain an element of truth in how many take elements from actual historical serial killer cases and implement them into the central plot, making these characters in the situation feel almost real. Take, for example, perhaps one of the finest examples of the serial killer / horror genre out there, which is Jonathan Demme's 1991 film, The Silence of the Lambs, which has remained a landmark entry into the horror genre into this day and age. In telling the story of serial killer Hannibal Lecter and the FBI agent Clarice Starr tasked with tracking down the motivation behind a new set of murderers, Demme has crafted a film that feels prevalent and inescapable, as if Lecter himself could exist outside of the confines of a silver screen. And in crafting these movies, horror directors create antagonists that feel raw and evil in a sense of the word, as if their malicious actions extend beyond the confines of the cinematic medium and into real-life situations as well, which further highlights and intensifies the horror attached to each of these movies. And you might ask, why do I bring all of this up before I review the new horror film Dangerous Animals? Well, this is because the film fails to achieve anything notable in the regards which I've just mentioned at length before. I can't even believe this movie practically. A horror filmmaker has crafted a film about a serial killer that doesn't feel horrific and inescapable beyond all reason like it should. Rather, Dangerous Animals is a film that feels borderline satirical at times, as if this wants to be a blatant parody of films such as Silence of the Lambs or Longlegs, but has neither the bark nor the bite needed to sell such a premise. And believe me, I went into this one with extremely high hopes. I am a huge fan of Jai Courtney's work, and I truly believe he's an underrated actor in every sense of the word. Whenever he's attached to a project, I always find myself interested in some sense of the word. In reading the premise for this film and watching the trailers attached to the marketing, my excitement was increased exponentially. You see, Dangerous Animals is a new horror film from the streaming service Shudder about a serial killer located on a boat off the coast of Australia who lures young women onto his vessel and then kidnaps them in the middle of the ocean, sacrificing these victims to the predatory sharks below for some unknown reason. And I can't speak for all audience members out there, but the premise was enough to get me hooked, no pun intended. And I went to my screening last week with all sorts of questions at the ready that I couldn't wait to have answered, such as, why does his character believe sharks to be some higher life form? What is he sacrificing these young victims for? What is his backstory or motive in doing something such as this? However, I walked away not only supremely disappointed from this film, but ultimately confused. To my absolute shock, none of my aforementioned questions was answered throughout the runtime. You see, Dangerous Animals is the type of horror film that doesn't want to answer any questions that audiences may have throughout the runtime. And while this is perfectly acceptable for many horror movies, and I've enjoyed a great many films that execute something like this to great effect, the real problem with this angle in a film such as Dangerous Animals is that it invites audiences to question many elements of the plot throughout, which is an absolute problem when it raises all sorts of important inquiries on behalf of the audience and devotes none of the runtime to actually explaining anything in depth, leaving the audience feeling ultimately cheated. Let's explore this further in the context of the film. The movie follows a young woman named Zephyr, who is an American who ran away to Australia for unknown reasons. She lives inside of a mobile van and loves to surf, which attracts her to the beach in the small hours of the morning, where she is then promptly kidnapped by Tucker, played by Jai Courtney, a serial killer who runs a shark excursion company under false pretenses. Waking up in the stronghold below decks with another female survivor, Zephyr must work to make her presence known to the outside world as Tucker's boat moves farther out into the ocean, away from all semblances of the mainland, and closer to predatory waters where sharks lie waiting for their next meal. One of the best elements of Dangerous Animals is easily Hassie Harrison's performance as the said character. Harrison avoids giving her character stock horror final girl tendencies and instills her own unique personality and flair into the character, which works insanely well in establishing both motives and also audience connection throughout, as you really do find yourself rooting for her to survive and succeed as the film progresses. And Jai Courtney is also deliciously unhinged here as Tucker, a man driven beyond all reason. His character beats and nuances are so complex, underlying a more sinister undertone while also remaining upbeat and slightly menacing in large portions. Although, it should be noted that I liked Jai Courtney's performance here, but I do not like his character or how his character is written or portrayed whatsoever, which I believe to be ultimately one of the main problems with the film here. You see, Tucker is the central antagonist of the film. He's the person on which main plot beats rely, who is used to sell a menacing and claustrophobic atmosphere. He is supposed to be the most terrifying thing about this film, which is why it's baffling and almost confusing why he's not terrifying in the slightest throughout the runtime. Everything about this character here is essentially a watered-down version of Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, complete with an over-the-top dance sequences overcut with footage of his victims struggling. His motives are also never clear enough to the audience, which makes it hard to even take him or his actions seriously. You see, in the sequences where he dangles his victims over shark-infested waters, complete with some of the worst visual effects work I've seen in a film in the calendar year, Tucker delivers a half-baked and underdeveloped inner monologue about how humans are sharks, or even worse in some cases. But the film never takes the time to explore what this actually means in the context of either the film or the grander scheme of things, which is ultimately slightly confusing. I ultimately never left the film understanding why this guy was obsessed with sharks so much, or why he filmed all of his victims on a tape recorder, or what his monologues were even supposed to mean or impart to the audience. And speaking of sharks, one of the most underwhelming elements of this entire film is how they are barely in the movie whatsoever, which is shocking for a movie which uses them for key points of tension throughout. In fact, only 2 victims in this entire film befall fates by a shark, which is done in such a poor way due to awkward scene blocking and once again less than stellar effects work. And there are so many times where logic just slips clearly out the door apparently, as characters make baffling choices that seem in direct contrast to their characterization thus far, and the film never lands a solid enough conclusion to stand apart in its own right. The third act in particular devolves into chaos, both in terms of execution and premise, and it ultimately becomes a test for audiences to see if their patience can wear on long enough to get through such a conclusion. Overall, I just left Dangerous Animals feeling confused over anything else. It's hard for a horror film to feel original in any regard. That much is obviously true, but when a film executes what seems to be original content in a less than stellar way, it really calls into question what the intent of the film truly is. The film ultimately isn't produced or made in an unbearable way, and it's clear that there are talented people attached to so much of this. The direction is quite good, and I would like to see more from Sean Byrne in the future, as it's clear he has a knack for framing horror-based sequencing in such an invigorating and evocative way. And this really is just a vehicle for Courtney to have fun as a deranged serial killer who sacrifices people to sharks while singing Baby Shark, yet I ultimately left Dangerous Animals wanting more, which is ultimately its biggest shortcoming. More context, more depth, more substance, and any right. It's an intriguing enough premise and story in its own regard, but it's missing that execution to make it go the extra mile and land in a satisfying enough regard. However, this is not to say that Dangerous Animals is a boring film. If you want to go just to see Courtney ham it up in key scenes, it's fun enough on that level for most audiences. Yet if you're looking for something innovative or unique in the horror genre, this isn't likely going to satisfy your cravings. That's why I'm giving Dangerous Animals a 2 out of 5 stars. Dangerous Animals is in theaters this Friday. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching this review on my channel. If you're new around here and you like the content you see, don't forget to click that subscribe button down below, like the video, and turn on push notifications. Also, leave comment suggestions down below for future video, essay, and review topics. With that being said, until next time, this is Mitchell signing off. Peace out.